Are you guys not reading the question?
How and why has the presidential power expanded since the ratification of the Constitution? Go.
In a speech to the Senate in 1834, President Andrew Jackson stated, "It was settled by the Constitution, the law, and the whole practice of government that the entire executive power is vested in the President of the United States." By the time Jackson gave the speech, the founders' view of presidency as an energetic but limited institution was becoming irrelevant. During Thomas Jefferson's 1800 campaign against John Adams, his main focus was to uphold the ideas of the founders. But even the noble Jefferson realized the limitations of the Constitution's vague enumerated powers once in office when he purchased Louisiana and enforced the embargo of 1807.
Jefferson's realization foreshadowed the rise of presidential power. By 1834, Andrew Jackson had become a key player in the expanded executive. He used his veto authority more than all of his predecessors combined. He also refused to support the Second Bank of the United States, impounding federal funds using his power as chief executive. When the Supreme Court ruled against the state of Georgia in the 1832 case of Worcester v. Georgia, Jackson is famously attributed to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." He proceeded with his policy anyway, eventually pushing Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, unfortunately resulting in the Trail of Tears.
Abraham Lincoln was checked by the judicial branch during the Civil War in the Supreme Court case Ex parte Milligan, after he unilaterally forced martial law on Maryland. In Federalist 69, Publius made clear that the president would not be able to raise and regulate fleets and armies by his own authority. However, Lincoln independently raised a blockade against southern ports, defying the intentions of the framers.
During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt bypassed his constitutional obligation in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, when he made executive agreements with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill without the consent of the Senate. Due to the tensions of the Cold War and increased military presence of communist powers within Vietnam, Lyndon B. Johnson continued the expansion of power when Congress surrendered its authority with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Johnson was able to pursue and escalate conflict in Vietnam without a declaration of war.
Because of the emergency banking crisis during the Great Depression, presidential power expanded yet again with Franklin Roosevelt's use of executive orders. In his second day in office, FDR issued an executive order closing the national banks. He established many New Deals programs like the Works Progress Administration without the approval of Congress. Following 9/11, Americans looked to the president to react forcefully. George W. Bush declared, "We will bring the terrorists to justice, or we will bring justice to the terrorists. Either way, justice will be done." He immediately grounded air traffic, raised the army, and shut down financial markets. 3 months later, he effectively declared war on Afghanistan with an executive order.
Time Magazine's editor and chief executive, Fareed Zakaria, has noted the media creates a perception that the president holds sovereignty along with Congress, though the framers envisioned Congress holding all the power. FDR exploited this when he attempted to appoint 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. Although met with congressional disapproval, he tried to win the favor of the public using his fireside chats. Today, networks such as Fox News and MSNBC further the perception of presidential power. Critics of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, blame it on the president and ignore the fact that Congress created, passed, and funded it.
During the Watergate scandal, the Supreme Court attempted to check Nixon by revoking most of his executive privileges. However, as Justin Jackson had earlier noted in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, "I have no illusion that any decision by this court can keep power in the hands of Congress. Only Congress itself can prevent power from slipping through its fingers." For Nixon, Congress reacted by initiating the process of impeachment. However, Nixon resigned and President Gerald Ford quickly pardoned him. Clearly, throughout history, Congress has rarely acted adequately to address the rise of the presidency. A good example of this is the Wars Power Resolution of 1973. This was Congress's first attempt to check abuses of power after the Vietnam War. However, it is a non-binding resolution and has never been invoked. Occasionally, Congress gets something right. One of the most effective checks that Congress has is the power to control the funds the president needs to enforce his laws.
In Federalist 70, Hamilton wrote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of a good government." This energy has grown beyond even Hamilton's expectations. With more conflicts, emergencies, and media coverage, presidents have pushed this to the extreme and advanced the limits of their powers. Thank you.
Motion to.
Are the president's creations of czars to monitor certain aspects of the economy constitutional?
Drugs are. Things like that.
Cars are.
Cars are.
The czar.
Yes, the president has the power to effectively use his office to faithfully execute the laws in any means necessary in order to achieve that goal would be constitutional.
Give me your best use of executive order in the history of our country. Examples.
The best use of an executive order would be, in World War I, when Wilson, made an executive, I don't know, I lost what I was saying.
The best use of an executive order, in my opinion, would have to be John F. Kennedy's initiation of affirmative action, which really started ingratiating disadvantaged minorities into American society in a way that they had not had before.
I believe that the greatest executive order was issued by FDR when he created the Works Progress Administration. And while it was already funded by Congress, it was his choice of what he chose to act. And it was acts like this that helped get us out of the Great Depression.
Do we need a multiple presidency where maybe we have a president that is in charge of economic development and then one in charge of social development? Or is the president powerful enough as just one person? Or how do you feel about a multiple presidency?
Well, the president isn't supposed to have as much power as he's perceived to today. So I think we need to focus more on Congress's power rather than having multiple presidents.
This goes back to our analysis from Fareed Zakaria, where he talks about the competing sovereignty between Congress and the president. That would only make the problem worse. It's creating a conflicting viewpoint between who's really in control when the power is supposed to lie with Congress, according to Article 1, Section 8.
Having a multiple presidency would be beneficial to the nation because the president could focus on what they have to, and they could delegate certain things for that to Congress to pass, and then separate presidents would focus specifically on those.
Or we can look back to the New Jersey plan, where while the way to get to the executive was different, there were multiple executives within the plan so that they would control each other's power. So no one executive would have too much power, and they would control each other in that sense.
When was federalism first tested by the Supreme Court? Or when was some early cases in the Supreme Court had to do with federalism?
Well, one good example is, I believe, Marbury v. Madison in the early 1800s, dealing with the states trying to tax the national bank and the question of whether or not the states were able to effectively ignore national laws and mandates to further their own goals, where the court ruled, of course, that the national government was supreme and that the states were not able to do that.
Another one would be Chisholm v. Georgia, where an individual sued Georgia to gain his money that he received in a will, and he won against a state, which in turn created the 11th Amendment.
Do you have time for one more?
Yeah.
Do you think it's right that the president's limited to 2 terms while members of the Congress have unlimited terms?
You said members of the Congress had,
Yeah. Do you think that's right? Or do you think
I
the president should have unlimited terms too?
I believe that the Congress should be limited in terms also, because they become like outdated and maybe new views need to be into Congress, because a lot of the congressmen today are just in political parties, and new views could help them break out of the party system.
Contrary to Sydney's beliefs, a system where we limit the president's power because he is perceived to have all of the power by the people is so that we can continually get new views in the office, whereas in Congress, there is a multitude of people. So changing one person is not going to have a dramatic effect on the entire situation. So simply limiting one person's term is not going to have as big of an effect on Congress as it will on the president.
What could Congress do right now, today, to rein in the power of the president?
Well, one key thing, as we reference in our testimony, is to create some kind of effective check on the president's abuse of war powers. Like we mentioned with the non-binding war powers resolution, Congress really hasn't done anything effective to check the president's war powers in any sense. So any kind of action on that front would be absolutely essential.
Anything that the president does, Congress supports by power of the purse. So they could, anything they're involved with right now, helping the president fund, they could withdraw their money and limiting his powers.
They could also, stop the use of signing statements within constitutional laws.
Was Benghazi a problem with the president, or did the media blow out the president's role in Benghazi?
Can you repeat the question?
So in Benghazi, was that the media has portrayed that as a lack of control by the president, but was that the president's fault, or has the media blown the president's role in Benghazi out of proportion?
The media has clearly overstated the president's impact in this. If anything, it's a failure of the intelligence community and has more to do with the CIA director, the director of the Defense Department, and people more concerned with our national security than the president, who was really not engaged with the process at all at the time.
Going off of what Chase said about perceived presidential powers, presidential scholar Hugh Hecla once stated that the perceived idea that the president is in charge of the government is simply an illusion, and this Benghazi example goes straight back to that.
Stop there. Go ahead, Colonel Marion, hit him with it.
President's commander-in-chief, he took personal responsibility already.
Yeah. But
Okay, he did. I mean, he's the commander-in-chief, the buck stops with him, and he said it. It's not the secretary, CIA director or secretary of defense, it's the president. He is the commander-in-chief, just remember that. A couple things with Supreme Court cases, try to get a date in there. Marbury vs. Madison, you knew. Tell them how you do dates real quick. This is a good tip on dates. Because I don't know when Chisholm was. When is Chisholm?
Yeah,
What
sorry.
year is Chisholm about?
1820.
Tell me your rule, it's a good one.
Well, here's the rule with dates. Goes from now until the end of time when you're doing history stuff. If you know the date, throw the date down. If you don't know the date,
1804 for Marbury.
throw the year. If you don't know the year, throw the decade, and you can go early, middle, or late of the decade. If you don't know the decade, throw the part of the century in which it's in the latter half of the 19th century, or in the middle of the 19th century.
That helps reference it.
And then, you're breaking it into 25-year chunks, and then you say, in the 18th century, that's a 100-year chunk. And if you don't know that, go time era, in the Middle Ages. You know what I mean? That's like
In the colonial era.
1,000 years.
That helps give a little perspective to the judges. A couple other things on executive order. I know you started somewhere. Have a couple good ones. Truman's desegregation of the military is a huge
Please.
one. That is a great one, I think, just to have. If you don't know any other ones,
Is it-
know that
Is the
one.
Emancipation Proclamation an executive order?
No.
It's just act as Commander-in-Chief.
Know some great examples of executive orders out there. That
How about-
one just jumped into my mind.
How about the worst example of an executive order?
Afghanistan.
That's great, no, I mean,
What
you
was,
think
what was the,
that.
what was the order?
Bush declared Afghanistan an active war zone.
An active war zone?
Yeah, and then that's what started like our military involvement.
Okay, so we were not justified in going into Afghanistan?
I mean, I would say no.
Ooh, okay.
You missed a president that I think you need to talk about. It's George Washington. He established the presidency. And I'm a Washington fanatic and I love George Washington. But he's the one, he didn't raise the power of, you said in your testimony Jackson raised the power of the, Washington established the power of the presidency. And I would say most historical scholars would say George Washington was our greatest president. With probably good justification. You really don't talk about him at all. If you don't get him in your testimony, you need to address him somewhere. He is the president's president. And they all look to him.
And the reason why it's so important is the fact that he didn't expand the power of the presidency as the first chief executive. It was well understood.
He could have done whatever he wanted.
As well as understood that we might as well have given the king, a king to King George Washington, because everyone loved him. And he could have just taken the power and run with it, we would have had, you know, another king in the United States, and he didn't.
The peaceful transition to number 2 is really unusual if you think about that. The other one I would hit on term limits, he was the guy that kind of made it not even an amendment. He just left after 2 terms, everyone else did. Roosevelt would have too, I think, if it wasn't in the middle of a war. And I don't think there would have been a need ever for a constitutional amendment to limit the president to 2 terms. I think it would have just been because George Washington did it. Do we ever wonder why there was only 2 terms for every president? It was because Washington set that precedent.
Emily, you had something to say?
There's a quote where George Washington said, "We didn't overthrow a king, so I could be another king," or something along
It's in
those
one of the books
lines.
in Mr. Clark's class, I could probably point it out which
Yeah.
book.
Hit GW.
And foreign policy, along the same lines of Washington, he established the idea behind the Monroe Doctrine, which was pretty much American foreign policy gold for 125 years, up until World War I. The idea that, you know, we'll stay in the Western Hemisphere, everyone else stays in the Eastern Hemisphere, and we won't mix until we absolutely need to. And that's Washington, he warned of that in his farewell address. Back to the worst executive order, how about internment of the Japanese during World War II? That's, I think it's called Executive Order 9066.
That was Roosevelt.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
And that's under Roosevelt, so,
Good one.
that's just crap. Ask Anthony Omaye's grandparents about that one, how they like that one. McCullough versus Maryland's the case.
Yeah, I know, I realized it
Yeah.
after I said it.
We also read.
You had, you
Yeah.
described the case beautifully.
Yeah.
It's a
Different case.
That is the right answer though. You also might wanna know federalism throughout the decade. What's a major limitation on federalism? Where did the Supreme Court finally put a stop to the expansion of presidential powers in like 1985? You guys know? US versus Lopez. That's a big one.
Presidential power or just federal power?
Sorry, federal power.
Yeah.
Congressional power. You guys know that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we know it.
Okay. Just checking.
We used it last time.
Good. I don't think Andrew Jackson said that quote.
That's why we said.
Someone
talked
else
about it
did,
last time.
someone else told us he did. Who would?
Mr. Clark and
Clark
Mr.
and
Daniels
Mr.
said that they
Daniels
believed he said
And we
that.
said,
So we
like-
changed it to attributed to have said.
Boy, just double check that, cause you don't want to.
There's no like one source that says for
Where's-
sure that he said that. It's attributed to him said that.
It also is attributed that, you know, Abraham Lincoln cut down the cherry tree, or George Washington cut down the cherry tree, but that never happened either.
You don't know that he could have.
He didn't.
He had a lot of
That was
spare
made up
time.
At one point in life,
He got the wood for his teeth.
I cannot tell a lie. Anything good? Good, good. Do something nice.
Alright, well, I know where you guys have been because I was Unit 4, and I'm partial, but let me tell you why Unit 4 is the hardest, because it is. You're gonna get questions from everywhere, because you're just the title, how are the values embodied in the Constitution shape the American institutions and practices? Everything falls under Unit 4, literally everything. I mean, President, Congress, judicial review, you know, history, modern day, quotes, Supreme Court cases, everything's gonna fall under you. And just right now, it just seems that you guys need to just expand your knowledge in general. You guys gotta know about the czars and what the EOP is, Executive
What
Office of
are
the
the
President.
stars? Ours.
Basically, the president appoints someone such as the car czar, and he looks over the car industry, essentially.
I think the drug czar is an easy.
Drug czar is an easy one.
Have you ever heard of the drug
So,
czar?
yeah, go ahead.
Drug czar, the great war against drugs in our country.
Right.
The drug czar was put in charge of stopping drugs in this country, illicit drugs.
Basically, all domestic drug policy, he handles it and makes recommendations to the president. So he's like, he is that second advisor. He is that president's,
Which is.
he's that other advisor to the president. And when he asked the question about should there be more than one executive, you say, yeah, there is already. We have a Secretary of State, we have a Secretary of Treasury, we have all these czars.
And you gotta look at even, you know, secretaries, the thing about Secretary of State and stuff like that is they have to be approved by Congress. Guess who doesn't? The EOP, which is the Executive Offices of the President. Where the President can bring in whoever he wants, tell him whatever he wants about anything. that doesn't have to be checked by Congress. So Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State had to be approved through Congress. Someone in his EOP, as it's referred to, doesn't have to be checked by
So
Congress.
czars or EOP?
Not necessarily. They're kind of, the EOP has its own title and the drug czars have its own title. And they're both very important because they're advisors to the president, which is why I asked you, we need a multiple presidency. Because a lot of people would argue that no, we don't, because we already have a multiple presidency. Because President Obama isn't the one that's making all of these decisions. He's being advised. And then it's important in this question, the reason I think that they put these two questions together is because the branches of government and the expansion of presidential power is directly related to the media, in my opinion, because the media puts everything on the president. Anything that happens in Congress, well, guess who the media portrays as in charge of Congress? President Obama. Congress is dysfunctional. Who do we look at as, oh, you know, yes, Congress is dysfunctional, but they're saying, why isn't President Obama stepped in and make it?
Where's his leadership?
Yeah, where's his leadership? So, a lot of the stuff that you got, and that's why I asked kind of the Benghazi example, because I would argue that it wasn't Obama's fault, because Obama isn't, like you said,
And I
isn't
think-
involved
yeah, I
in
think
the
that's what
gay
Chase was trying to
relations.
argue.
Exactly. The other problem is that with this question, with Unit 4, you have to have Supreme Court, you have to have quotes. So work on just learning some quotes that apply to all of these questions, because you're gonna need quotes, and you're gonna need Supreme Court cases. I feel you, and I was right in that situation too, and I'd leave some of these practices where I was like, shit, I just effed up. Because, but that's the nature of Unit 4 specifically, because there's so much to learn in so little time. So just try to like learn broad, you gotta learn broad ideas with specifics, if that makes sense. Cause, you know, oh, and your Bush quote, I don't like it, I don't know how you guys feel about it, I don't like the Bush quote, because in my opinion, and this could just be my opinion, but grounding planes, any president would have done that. It didn't, that had nothing to do with,
So maybe
He's the
it's not that you
president.
don't like the
Yeah.
quote, you can maybe find a better quote.
yeah, find a better quote
There
from
you
someone
go.
else.
Okay.
Just, yeah.
And with, back to the Benghazi, I hate to be a dead horse, but I think RTC Director of the Year, Colonel Mayor and I were kind of both on the same wavelength on this. The buck stops at the president's desk. So even though he may have had no idea what the hell was happening with Benghazi at all, he's got to own it.
Well, the fact that he did own it in the
He's got
media.
it. He's gotta go. My fault. I'm the president of the United States. I should have known better. I didn't get the briefing that day. It's my fault. Don't worry about these guys and me, because he's the president.
Well,
So
that's- yeah.
if the question's something like what he asked, where it's like, what role did the president play in this? Like, did the media overblow that? Should we still incorporate, like, Obama said, the buck stops with me, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah. I'd say, yeah, although he may not have been involved in the day-to-day operations, he's the president, he's the leader, and sometimes leaders get blamed for things that their subordinates do.
So just try to learn some more quotes, try to learn some more Supreme Court cases, and,
You got a great unit.
yeah.
It's really fun. Know your three branches of the government.
It's tough,
And maybe each one of you just, I'll be the expert on the Supreme Court cases. I'll be an expert on legislative matters. And have it take to, on this question, inevitably will come up, who do you think's the best president? Or why do you think they're the best president? Most